let's do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to push that mic away, right? So I don't.
Well, but I have to use it, and then you can push it away, because I have to introduce you. Let's see. Actually, we got
Greatest rock and roll band. Or Johnny Cash. You can do the Johnny Cash.
What's Elvis's?
Biggie, the L. Just say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll let you say that. That's at the end. That's what you're going to say. Okay, folks, we'll get started. Welcome to Cantini. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the First Division Museum that runs these dates with history, dates with military history, I might specify. I know all of you have been here many times, but this is Cantini, and it's the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who owned and published the Tribune and served in the First Division in World War I. And that's why there's a First Division Museum here at Cantini Park, and that's the connection to us and the Colonel. And he ran the Tribune for many, many years, became fabulously wealthy, didn't have kids, left his wealth to establish our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, does $50 million worth of charitable grants every year. So that's the legacy of Colonel McCormick. And we're here on this beautiful park, his historic estate, and we're about to reopen after a multi-million-dollar renovation, the First Division Museum on August 26th. And I think you'll be real pleased with what that museum looks like. The purpose of that museum is not only to tell the story of the Big Red One, but it's also to help connect us, the people, we the people, our citizenry with our soldiers. I think it's absolutely critical in a democracy that the people are familiar with soldiers and with military institutions because they ultimately belong to us. And so it's in that vein that we present this series of lectures on various aspects of American military history. And tonight, I know this will disappoint all of you who just saw Elvis and came for that. But it's not Elvis, it's Brian, for better or worse. But he's going to do an Elvis impersonation later. And so Brian Linn is professor of history and Ralph R. Thomas professor in liberal arts at Texas A&M University. He is a native of Hawaii. He completed his graduate work at The Ohio State University. He's a recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and an Olin Fellowship at Yale University, and has been a visiting professor at the Army War College and a Fulbright Fellow at the National University of Singapore and also at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. This may give you the idea that he spends very little time in Texas, and I don't know how he pulls all that off, but anyway, he gets away with it. He is a past president of the Society for Military History and has given numerous papers and lectures in the United States and internationally. He is the author of several seminal and pillar books of American military history, including the U.S. Army and Counterinsurgency in the Philippine War, 1899 to 1902, Guardians of Empire, the U.S. Army in the Pacific, 1902 to 1940, the Philippine War, 1899 to 1902, The Echo of Battle, The Army's Way of War, and now Elvis's Army, Cold War GIs, and the Atomic Battlefield. On a personal note, I've known Brian for 37 years. He arrived at The Ohio State University as a graduate student in military history in 1979, and I followed in 1980. I was an active duty Army captain, and I'm sure he viewed me as a proto-fascist, and I wasn't. But I pretty much viewed him as a wild-eyed hippie who probably was on something. Since then, I have been, for my entire life, intensely proud of and in some ways in love with the Army of the United States. It is a profoundly good and decent organization, and I could say much more about that. Brian, on the other hand, has been a persistent critic of the Army of the United States, and so he and I can hardly spend 5 minutes together before he's lambasting me on some part of the Army that is goofed up or messed up or didn't work right or the generals are wrong or whatever it was. And yeah. And would have been even better had I stayed a little longer, but I decided not to, and that's probably because of my association with you. But anyway, in this entire nearly 4-decade relationship now, Brian is a patriot. He loves this country, and he studies its Army, and he studies the reasons that we go to war, and he's critical for all the right reasons, and his research is impeccable, and he's the kind of scholar the military historians provide a tremendous public service because they inform us about the reality of our armed forces so that we are informed and can make good, conscientious decisions about where our soldiers go in our name and why they go there and what they experience when they're there. And that's what you get from military history, and it's so essential to a democracy. So, on that note, it is my deep pleasure to introduce my old friend, Professor Brian Linn.
That's quite a buildup. I do want to thank the 1st Division Museum for hosting me and giving me a chance to talk about my new book. Paul, who we met on the softball fields at Ohio State. We went there before it was the Ohio State University. It was just state or the farm when we did. I guess he goes by JK. Thanks for handling all the logistics and so forth. And I did some of my work research here, and the research staff was just outstanding. Really helped. So those who serve in today's military are part of an all-volunteer elite. According to a recent Gallup poll, Americans have more confidence in the United States Armed Forces than they do in any other government institution. In fact, they've almost got twice as much confidence. In fact, they do have more than twice as much confidence in the Army right now, or in the Armed Forces, than they do in the presidency. And we hear a lot today about things like revolutions in military affairs, about drones, and about satellites, and about computers. And I think it's worth looking at an Army that went through a similar RMA. The 50s can also inform us about how different things are then than they are now, with perhaps the most important being that Selective Service tied the American public to its armed forces in peacetime between the Korean War and Vietnam closer than it's ever been. The citizen soldier became the peacetime representative of the United States military. All right. Conscription was, I would argue, the great leveling experience. Straight out of, I don't look like Elvis, I do look like Peter Townsend of The Who, and that was straight out of Magic Bus. But I would, argue that if you want to read about citizen soldiers in peacetime, look at the 1950s Army. In 1953, which was the year I was born, the United States Army had 3 Hall of Fame baseball players. That one up there. Anyone know who that is? That's Willie Mays. Okay. He was in there with Whitey Ford and Mr. Cub himself, Ernie Banks. And for those of you who are White Sox fans, Nellie Fox was in the service just a few years previously. So too were several members of the 1963 Chicago Bears champion team, including the quarterback, Billy Wade. And so, in a sense, what you've got here is an Army. I hate to tell you this, but you've managed to print every other word of every other page. So this is going to get a little, JK? Technology. All right. Okay. So we talked about Willie Mays. There's a lot of music stars in there. Those of you who are as old as I may remember Lou Rawls, Clyde McPhatter, Herb Reed of the Platters, Chris Christopherson, Jerry Garcia, who founded the Grateful Dead. Anyone know who that is? That's Jimi Hendrix. But to me, the most interesting picture is that. That's John Eisenhower. During the entire time that he was president, Dwight D. Eisenhower's son was in the armed forces. If war was declared, that president knew he was condemning his own son to a very likely death. Now, one of the things that's interesting is Americans no longer feel that their political leader should bear such a personal responsibility for military decisions. But frankly, I think the 50s had a more admirable attitude. There's a couple of other examples why the Forgotten Army is important. I would argue we really can't understand American attitudes towards the armed forces, the role of the citizen soldier, baseball, rock and roll, all sorts of things, if we don't understand the military between Korea and Vietnam. And the greatest symbol of that is, of course, this character. This is the most famous member of the Forgotten Army. In fact, if you asked anyone to say who was in the U.S. military between 1953 and 1965, Elvis is probably the one they would think of. It's sort of interesting. If you ask him in World War II, it's Audie Murphy. But in the 50s, it's Elvis Presley. But why is he so important? Because by entering the armed forces in 1958 without protest, by telling the Army and the American public, I will go where the Army wants me to go, I will do what the Army wants me to be, he demonstrated that this was a democracy, that everybody was equal before the law, and the importance of a citizen serving in the armed forces to demonstrate that they belong to this nation. Now, shortly before he went into service, Elvis released a movie called Jailhouse Rock, in which he played a hoodlum and gyrated around. And he did the choreography for that, by the way. So this is the real Elvis doing the real Elvis Presley moves. And every American parent, I imagine, was horrified. What would happen if their daughter brought this character home? And it said everything that conservative America believed about rock and roll, about American teenagers, the number one problem next to communism that the nation faced. And this was Elvis. Now, he goes into the service. He comes out as a clean-cut, patriotic, all-American boy. And just like any other patriotic American boy, he makes a movie about this that's called GI Blues. And the closing scene of GI Blues is Elvis standing in front of his fellow soldiers saluting the American flag. Now, that is about as great a social transformation as you can see. Now, you might say it's replacing one false Hollywood image with another, but it's not. Because Elvis, as we'll find out, actually did go into the Army, and he did go out in the 3rd Armored Division, and he pulled his 2 years of duty in Germany, and he was a real soldier, and apparently a really good soldier. I have yet to find a single bad comment about Elvis, both from regulars, officers, people that served with him. He was a very good soldier. So what kind of army wants Elvis Presley? Well, Elvis Presley joined an army that was in the middle of a transformation. And this period, for those who lived through it, is a period of great soul-searching for the United States Army, a period where it really didn't know if it had a mission at all. President Eisenhower's new look and his strategy of massive retaliation with strategic nuclear weapons used first by the Air Force and then by the Navy left the United States Army with really no mission except to serve as a tripwire in Europe and Asia. And then after the other services achieved victory with their atomic weapons, the Army would go in and perhaps occupy and govern the former Soviet Union. Remember that this is only 10 years, really since the occupation of Germany and Japan had begun. And so a lot of people thought that that, in fact, was the Army's job. Under Eisenhower, the Army suffered almost a 50% cut in manpower in 6 years, and an almost greater cut in its budget. Now, Chief of Staff Maxwell Taylor, who served under President Eisenhower during the height of the massive retaliation era, was convinced that the Army had to adapt to the atomic age or it would face obsolescence. It would become a sort of militarized version of the Coast Guard. And this would require a total revolution in military affairs. Now, to do this meant he was going against President Eisenhower, he was going against the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Strategy, certainly the other services. And it meant selling the Army to the American public, convincing the American public that the Army was a new, modern, atomic age military force. Taylor and the Army's vision that evolved during this time was called tactical or limited atomic war. Very simply, Army theorists argued that massive retaliation was a colossal bluff, that no American president would unleash the nation's atomic arsenal if it meant that the nation's own cities would be targeted by Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. And very soon, the Soviets would recognize that massive retaliation was a bluff, and they would call it. And the Soviet Army would come rolling across through the Fulda Gap and all those areas, sweep into Germany, then on to France, and into the English Channel. And the United States would have the unsavory option of either nuking its Western European allies or accepting the communization of Europe. And with that, of course, the loss of the Cold War. And these pictures, some of you are old enough to remember a show called The Big Picture, the United States Army's report. It was a television show. And these are images taken from The Big Picture. And they constantly drummed home to the American public that the Red Army numbered 2,500,000 perched on Europe's borders. The United States forces had barely 10% of that. Army public relations bombarded the public with pictures of Soviet missiles and tanks and rockets and thousands of troops marching across Red Square singing the Internationale. But simply highlighting the threat was insufficient, because everyone knew that. The Army had to convince the public and Congress and the President and its own soldiers that you could actually win an atomic war. To do that, it had to create a battlefield scenario in which much smaller, remember, because there are only 10% of the Red Army, these much smaller American forces could not only stop a Soviet invasion of Europe, they could actually defeat it and roll the communists back. Now, this required new tactics, new organizations, and new weapons to wage this tactical atomic war. The Army's divisions and regiments had to be reconfigured into smaller, leaner combat organizations that could fight over much greater distances with much more mobility, because you had to avoid those Soviet masses, swing around, operate on the flanks, get into the rear areas. You had to be fast and mobile. Tactics. Remember, we had just fought the Korean War, which for 2 years had been a stalemate of massive attritional artillery fire. Now tactics had to be decentralized. Troops had to be independent. They had to be mobile. They had to operate in depth and dispersion. And Soviet manpower had to be defeated by better American technology. And the central part of this technology were what were called low-yield tactical, as opposed to city-destroying. These would only be used against military units, hence they were tactical. Now, a low-yield weapon, in Army parlance, was 20 kilotons, which is roughly the size of the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. So when we're talking about limited atomic war, I want us to understand it's limited only in terms of multi-megaton devices wielded by the U.S. Air Force. Oh, sorry. So this is the Army's argument. Okay. The Soviets are pouring in, and the U.S., the GI has the option, his rifle's broken because he didn't get new equipment, of pulling the detonator and setting off the thermonuclear device, or jumping off the abyss, or surrendering. And that's it. That's what Eisenhower's left him with. This, on the other hand, is how the Army's going to fight. This is from a lecture by the Commandant of the Command and General Staff College, which at that time was in charge of writing the Army's tactical atomic doctrine. So this is, if you will, from the great oracle itself. The primary concepts of this remain constant throughout the 1950s. Some would say they continued to influence air-land battle in the 1980s, and at least some of us that are reading the current doctrine of multi-domain battle say they're still there. Very simply, Cold War Army tacticians envision a vast battlefield extending over hundreds of miles, over which move dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of small, independent combat units using a variety of transport, armored personnel carriers, tanks, helicopters, jeeps, everything. They would move dispersed, avoiding those mass Soviet tank formations, hover around on the flanks, and use atomic weapons precisely to smash those tank formations, to smash the depots, to smash the communications. Then they would concentrate to whop up, and then disperse to begin the entire process again. And very quickly, this idea permeated down so that if you were a young ROTC graduate heading off to officers training, you would find yourself, if you were lucky, learning how to wage this type of war. Now, I'd like to point some of the things out about this. First, notice these advanced technologies. Brand new tank, a helicopter. This, for the people in the 50s, was straight out of popular mechanics or science fiction. These were things like the flying car, that were really. But of course, in the background is the atomic cloud. And in the foreground, here's Arn Mike, the infantry officer with an M1 and a bayonet charging into this atomic explosion. Now, this illustration is, again, from a big picture television show, which shows how this would morph in perhaps 20 years. And again, there's the atomic cloud, and here are these small units that are probably just beginning to concentrate, to mop up, and then they will disperse again to strike another Soviet concentration. Now, we've talked about the sort of concept. How do you turn this concept, this futuristic vision of war, into a reality? Well, to do that, Chief of Staff Taylor had to create an organization that could fight it, and he had to get the equipment. Well, in September 1956, Chief of Staff Taylor, and there he is, unveiled the brand new, and I'll call it the reorganization of the Combat Infantry Division, or ROKID, or ROSID, I'm not too sure. It's been pronounced both ways. And he set up his old World War II unit, the 101st Airborne Division, as the Army's first atomic age division. Now, Taylor recognized that ROSID wasn't a very inspiring term, so he renamed it, or nicknamed it, the Pentomic Division. Penta, from its 5 battle groups, and of course, atomic, meaning that it would fight atomic war. those of you who are fans of Mad Men will be happy to know that Taylor said, "I got the idea from Madison Avenue." It was a marketing ploy. Now, the pentomic division was intended to be more flexible, more mobile. It could move dispersed. It had a bunch of futuristic new equipment, new tanks, the missiles. Taylor was very fascinated by missiles, and he believed that missiles could replace artillery, or most of the artillery, and that you could put atomic warheads on them, and by doing that, you would cut your supply lines, and you could cut your logistics, and then you could move much more quickly. And how would this organization fight? Well, that's, again, from the big picture. Here's these dispersed battle groups. And here, of course, is what we all recognize as an atomic cloud, some vaporized Soviet tank force. And through sophisticated radio communications, these 5 dispersed groups could maneuver as one or then operate independently. The ultimate combination of atomic firepower and mobility was the Davy Crockett, which was unveiled in 1960. That is an atomic warhead. Between 10 to 20 tons of TNT, could fire it with rather erratic accuracy from 2 to 4 kilometers. Unfortunately, the blast radius was greater than 2 to 4 kilometers. But technology, if you think about how big the Nagasaki bomb was, and then you reflect that in 15 years the Army shrunk it down to the size of a very large football, you can see why people were so excited about this and why they actually thought this was so viable. And it's important to recognize, to Taylor and the Army, this was just the first generation. Look what we've done in 15 years. In 15 years from now, we'll have one of these. Okay? Army 80. This is a Command and General Staff College presentation. That's going to be on the battlefield. And it will fight like this. 5,000 meters, 1,000, 20,000 meters. There it is, our friend. All of it operating out there. There's the atomic cloud. Okay, and so you can see how exciting this vision was, and how entrancing it was for people in the 1950s. And this slide shows sort of the transformed Army at work. Here's the new soldier armed with the new weapon, the M14, on the atomic battlefield. Okay, there he is, dispersing out of a helicopter. Again, a brand new invention. But we all know this didn't happen. Okay, we all know that picture is really not inaccurate. If we take that out and put jungles in it, it's probably familiar to some of the people in this audience. So this is clearly a transformation effort that failed. Okay, and why? I mean, this is something that we should study. We're always told about successful military changes, but I think we should look a little bit at what happens when the American taxpayer, God bless him, dumps millions and millions of dollars, and the thing turns out to not work. Not that would happen nowadays, but in those days, exactly, it was all fixed. It was all fixed after this. Well, if you're cynical, I've read this explanation. There's a very cynical explanation for why pentomic failed, and that was it never was meant to work. It was simply a way of getting more money. Others viewed Maxwell Taylor as a sort of evil genius, a ruthless careerist who would sacrifice everything to get ahead. Some have found very specific flaws. My friend Paul Jussel, who did his dissertation on this, said, they could never get radios to work. And if you can't talk to each other and people are popping off atomic weapons, you have a severe morale problem. And so they could never get these 5 battle groups to maneuver at all because the radios never worked. And no one would ever touch off an atomic weapon because they were afraid they'd blowing up their own people. But I think there was a different reason. And this is why I think Elvis's army. At one point, I was just going to do a normal military change of organization and doctrine and equipment. But what really fascinated me with Elvis's army was the drafty army, was the people in the army. And I think what you've got here is a vision of war and pentomic divisions that were predicated on the fact that the American soldier, the American teenager coming into the army was far better than his Soviet opponent. The army believed that young Americans entered the ranks already knowing about electronics, already knowing about mechanics, already having all these skills. And they were also motivated to take on the challenge of using these skills on the atomic battlefield. So what we have here is really a military revolution that's based on something that's usually left out of the equation: high-quality personnel, high-quality enlisted personnel, high-quality officers. And that's what I think Elvis Presley just sort of went off on the deep end, because what fascinated me was this wonderful vision of atomic war that was General Taylor and his fellow officers were expounding, and the reality of life in the 1950s Army as was experienced by Elvis Presley and the people in it. And to do that, you have to look at all that boring stuff that American military historians tend to ignore. We always assume the units go from one place to another and the commander says, do this, and they all do it and everything like, all that good stuff. You should start digging into things like maintenance records or backlogs on equipment or training records or recruitment issues or retention issues or fights over pay or public relations. I wound up having a whole chapter on public relations because it turned out that Hollywood and television and the Army really had to use each other to sort of keep things going. Or command climate, or social engineering, or even athletics, of all things. These are all the things that life in the field army in the 50s was concerned about. In atomic war, that was nice, but they had to get through all these other problems in order to get to where they were supposed to go. Now, as the general said, pentomic needed high-quality, high-skilled personnel. And to attract these personnel, the Army emphasized the service's commitment to education and technical training, to good benefits, and to travel. I mean, the 8th Infantry Division was a pretty tough outfit, but you notice he's not carrying an M1, he's got a map of Europe. In short, the Army was a place that young people could go and learn to be productive citizens. And if they were really good, they could make it a career and retire at 42 with a pension. Now, as Major Counts explained in that quotation from the big picture, this was an army designed for, and I'll quote, the modern American soldier who cut his teeth on radio grids and model airplanes, and brought those technical skills into the service. Army transformation agenda required that the enlisted soldier master something like 500 what are called MOSs, or military occupational specialties. Some of these had not existed when General Counts entered the Army in the late 1930s. At the beginning of World War II, for example, as far as I can find, and I've looked, there was not a single military occupational specialty for a missile technician. 15 years later, there's 70. Okay? I mean, can you imagine the shock of being a World War II officer and 15 years later finding all this new stuff in your Army? It took over a year to master some of the technical specialties that were required to use those missile systems that pentomic was dependent on. But it also required high-tech vocations and all sorts of other things. Television, a new medium that they were beginning to use. They were beginning to use drones. They were beginning to use computers. They were beginning to use data processing, radios, all sorts of high-tech stuff, miracle stuff that's coming out in the 1950s that the Army had to train people to use. And it wasn't just the high-tech people. The Army also, in those days, did its own work, meaning it cooked its own food, it guarded its own post, it built its own posts. All those blue-collar construction jobs, that are now done by contractors, back in the day, the Army did. And so you had to train people to operate bulldozers and work on radios and build roads and pick up cigarettes, a very important duty in the United States Army. And finally, and somewhere in this skilled labor, you had to find those trained warriors who could operate in the atomic battlefield, who could use those sophisticated dispersion, concentration, dispersion tactics, who were familiar with those weapons, and would continue to use them even after their officers and their friends had all been turned into radioactive dust. Okay? Well, that's quite a challenge, and personnel challenge. I mean, you can imagine being a human relations expert looking at this. That's what the Pentomic Army needed. What did they get? Well, as this chart shows, the U.S. Army remained dependent until the late 1960s, or until the 1960s, on selective service, what we call the draft, or conscription, or induction. Once trained, the draftee was eligible for 2 years of service, and that, if you went through basic and advanced, you had about 17 months for the most minimally skilled. If you wanted to train this person to be an electronics guy on a Nike site, you were going to get 9 months out of him because it took about 12 months to train him. Now, the obvious solution is to get more people to volunteer, to go to an all-volunteer army. And Taylor kept claiming they were going to an all-volunteer army, but it's hard to believe. He was actually manipulating the statistics. Yes, it's true the number of volunteers increased, the number of regular Army versus draftees increased, but that was not because more people were joining the Army. It was because draft calls were getting cut. So in fact, if you do shrink from 1 million people to 600,000 people, then, and the number of volunteers stays consistent, you will have a larger number of volunteers. It doesn't mean more people are joining the Army. It just means you've hit a base of people who will join, and you're not going any higher than that. And they never did throughout the decade, because the number of people who joined for 3 years was largely predicated on the number of people who thought they were going to get drafted. The largest incentive for volunteering in the United States Army was what was called volunteering to avoid the draft. If you had a high draft number, or you're pretty certain you were going to get drafted, you volunteered. And this is not just me, by the way. I've got Major General Hershey, who ran the Selective Service, explaining in a lecture to the Army War College, saying, you guys think you're popular? 2/3 of your soldiers come in to get out of the draft. And so that's it's not me making this stuff up. That's what the head of the Selective Service said. So, and the reason you volunteered is you had a much better choice of assignments. If you volunteered, you could largely pick where you went, and you could pick what technical specialty. And in some years, you could pick 2 technical specialties you could be trained at, the famous 2-for-1. So, to be blunt, most people were volunteering not to get into the Army. They were volunteering to get out of the combat arms. And I think these quotes make it clear. This is from the head of the Army Public Relations. Yes, the Army is in a state of transformation, but not the kind of transformation that Taylor wanted. I mean, this is a personal... Can you imagine running a business where 85% of your workforce turns over every 2 years? And it means that the Army has to annually train a new workforce. I don't think even McDonald's has this type of turnover, So, who's coming in? Well, as you can see from these statistics, this is not necessarily the people that General Counts was counting on to join the Army. In fact, there's a great variety of educational background of young men entering the armed forces. Now, some of the people in this category 1, which is what the Army wanted. I mean, the Army wanted these 2 categories. Some of these people are deferred because they're going into ROTC. Some join the Navy or the Air Force. Some people, and it'll be shocking to believe this, manipulated the system, Ivy League graduates and various other schools, to get out, to get doctors, to find medical reasons, to all sorts of reasons, go into law school. Hershey's favorite story, I'll just tell you, Hershey did not pull any punches. He was really a character. So he's talking to the Army War College, and he says, when Sputnik went up, there was this panic in the United States. The Russians had jumped the gun on us. Their people were better scientists, they had better engineers, and it's because their school system was better, okay? Because they're getting science and math, all those things we do, STEM. They're getting STEM in the 50s, and we're not. We're getting a bunch of liberal arts stuff and, reading too much Jack Kerouac or whatever we're doing in high school. It's wrong. So we need, and why is this? Because there's not enough males teaching in our high schools. See, there's not enough male teachers, and that's why we're falling down at math and science. No, I'm not making this up. This is a true story. So Hershey says, so what did we do? We deferred draft to anyone who would go in to teach, any male who would teach high school became draft exempt. And in 5 years, the number of male high school teachers had risen by over 20%. I think it's a very interesting story about the 50s, and it gives you a really good it gives you a good reality check from all these people who will never be drafted, but who all think the draft is a wonderful thing as long as they or their kids don't go. I'm sort of tired of listening to them. Oh, sorry. This is the real problem. And here is what's called Category 4. Category 4 means very simply functionally illiterate and with no technical skills at all. And these people were a real problem. They required constant supervision. They took much longer to train. You had to have other people do most of their work for them. You're certainly not going to give them a Davy Crockett and tell them to cut loose. So this was a real problem. Well, the obvious solution is to keep people. Okay? And the Army always looked at the draft as a temporary necessity. It would, sooner or later, people, if the Army got, because they had a semester called, people would volunteer. But again, if you remember what General Counts says, what we want are educated, high-tech people. This group is who they need to keep. And they need to keep about a third of them every year, because if you've got volunteers, 3-year rotation, it means that's going to turn over in 3 years. So the goal is to get a third, of these people and a third of these people. And as you can see, they never come close. They can never get the draftees, no matter what they do. This is a statistical anomaly. When they started counting as draftees people who volunteered in the first 2 weeks of basic training, which the Congress finally made them stop doing. You get this guy after 3 weeks, and the sergeant say, "How would you like to be a clerk typist?" "Oh, that sounds really good to me." Okay, volunteer, sign here, and there you go. Who does stay in? These guys. Okay? Unskilled labor, the guys who do the work that the draftees can actually do. And this is you've seen it a couple times, but this is the statistic that really is pretty appalling. Category 4 is, remember, those functionally illiterate people comprise over a quarter of the non-commissioned officers in the U.S. Army in around 1957. We have a stereotype. You all read Beetle Bailey. Beetle Bailey's been running around since Mort Walker got out of the Army. Well, Sergeant Snorkel isn't that much of a stereotype. In fact, he probably existed, or someone like him. And so here's now you can imagine being a Harvard-educated math major like Tom Lehrer going into the U.S. Army, and this is your first introduction into the regular Army. And Tom Lehrer actually wrote a very funny song called "It Makes a Fellow Proud to Be a Soldier," which describes a sergeant who came from Georgia and was still learning English. So that was it. That's the regular Army. Now, any teacher will tell you, if the students are deteriorating, and by the way, all you parents, they are, dumb down your curriculum. Make it easier for them to understand. And the Army did do that. It created something called PS Magazine, Preventative Service, that had Connie Rod, who was quite something. You'd have pin-ups of Connie Rod in all the shops and maintenance facilities. Soldiers read it, but again, remember what General Count said, who's coming into the Army, who we need, and you have to wonder about an atomic age Army that's training its people with comic books. And Paul will tell you this, that's not a problem because leadership will resolve these problems. I got to let you read this. Bill Mauldin, Willie and Joe, combat infantrymen in World War II, goes out to interview teenagers for Colliers, and he writes this article, Teenagers, What's Wrong with Them? Out on the beach during spring break, he runs into this guy who is the top ROTC cadet in his class, and he says, well, where are you going? And the guy says, quartermasters. Mauldin says, do you think that's good for your career? The guy says, no, but it's safe. And then he goes into this. And that's a generational shift. By the way, as a son of a World War II veteran, I heard a variation of this very talk, and I think a lot of us did. I remember one time getting angry at my dad during the 60s and said, your generation, tolerated racism, and your generation, did nothing for this, and your generation did this. And he said, my generation was fighting Mr. Hitler. It took all our time. Last time I tried that one on him. But you also remember that all those guys in the 50s grew up with at least one veteran in their family. And they had heard about what it was like. Now, in a typical year in the 1950s, the U.S. Army acquired something like 14,000 potential second lieutenants. But less than 1,000 of these were designated for the regular Army, for the full-time professional forces. The majority of them were commissioned from ROTC, and the others came in largely as doctors or dentists. And the ROTC graduates either did a 6-month tour on active and then did 7 years in the reserves. These were the famous 6s and 7s. Or they did 2 years of active duty, and then they went back. Now, what you have then is a sort of transitory, unstable personnel system that's in the enlisted corps, repeated in the officer ranks. The Army viewed these incoming lieutenants as absolutely crucial, both for public relations. You wanted the best and brightest to be wearing, Army khakis and not be like Steve Canyon and wearing Navy Air Force blues. And this would sell the service to the American public, But you also needed these college-educated officers because they were going to bring in the technical and managerial skills that would augment the combat experience of your World War II and Korean War veterans, most of whom had had their education interrupted by the war. In 1954, less than half of the officers in the United States Army had a college degree, and about a third of them had less than 2 years of college. So you really needed these incoming college graduates out of ROTC to bring in those skills that those wartime commanders didn't have. But as this chart indicates, in those 3 to 12 years of captain to major, there was a valley of thousands of people who didn't stay in. The Army wanted about 75% of those ROTC people at the end of their 2 years to sign on either for the active Army or for the reserves and then go back onto active duty. The highest it ever got was 20%. And the lack of experienced captains and majors meant that most companies were often run by second lieutenants. Okay, brand new, straight out of ROTC, you go through your officer's qualification course, and then you're suddenly commanding a company, which ought to be a captain of 3 to 5 years ahead of you. Now, this had a cascading effect. All of us have probably had an inexperienced worker, and our solution is to micromanage them. So the staffs pulled out the good officers and then turned them around to make sure these inexperienced officers fulfilled their responsibilities. And this, in turn, led to some resentment on the part of those junior officers who, after all, had been promised you're going to command, and in fact found that they were being micromanaged. And this had all sorts of effects in terms of who's staying in and who's getting out. And in fact, I think it was Life magazine, maybe it was Saturday Evening Post, had this thing about this hemorrhaging of junior officers in the U.S. Army becoming a crisis. And in fact, it did touch off a presidential panel to how are you going to keep people in the service. So, Paul says, well, he's very critical of the U.S. Army. Is this just an example of an organization that just sort of never really recovers from World War II in Korea? If so, why bother studying it? I mean, beyond the fact that it's a really interesting part of what happens when you have a citizen soldier military, something that I think a lot of people that advocate it haven't really thought about. But to me, that's only half the story of this. Does anyone know what this picture is? Pardon? Close. One before that. Little Rock, Arkansas. And who are those soldiers? That's the 101st Airborne Division 2 or 3 months after General Taylor stood them up as the first all-atomic army. And they're escorting African-American students into Central High School. This is an iconic moment, by the way. These are federal troops in the streets of the segregated South enforcing racial equality. It's a decisive turning point in the civil rights movement. And many, I would say, in the city, in this country, in the state, owe far more to the 101st doing that than they do to the heroics you've seen on television's Band of Brothers. I find it really interesting that the candidate that said that used to be the governor of Arkansas. So if anyone should know that the Army is a social experiment, you would think it would be him. Here's another thing the Army did. The Army inherits a lot of veterans whose education had been undercut. And it inherited it got all those Category 4s and Category 3s. And instead of throwing up its arms and trying to kick them all out, it took on a responsibility of educating them. And we sort of ignore that too. This is fiscal year 1954, but you could look at fiscal year 55, 56, 57, 58, probably all the way up to 1960 when they finally stopped taking in Category 4s. And I would note, how many people in the United States at this point didn't get a grade 4 education or didn't get a grade 8 education? Okay, and that's endemic of the school system at this time. And these statistics, and remember at this time, the Army's only 1.2 million, and about 300,000 of them are in school. Okay, and it doesn't cover all those tens of thousands of people that are in those technical courses, learning to be MOS, radio specialists, truck drivers, electricians, cooks, mechanics, 500 other things. They don't cover the Army's voluntary vocational education program, all those craft shops the Army set up so people could learn woodworking and basic mechanics. They don't talk about voluntary education, people who had a grade 8 or who had a high school who are going into school not on the Army's dime but in their own spare time. We don't even comprehend the impact of this massive educational program on the 1950s workforce. I have a really hard time believing that the happy days when people were employed, when people had skills and so forth, wasn't a great deal due to what they got in the service. I started working construction in around 1969, 1970. All the skilled labor, all the drillers and the mechanics had all been in the service. And most of them had learned that skill when they were in the service. It took kids out of small towns or the inner city or nowhere, and it taught them how to fix trucks and how to run machinery and how to weld and all these other skills that we no longer have a place for people to learn in many cases. So I think there's a real connection with the 50s prosperity, the good years, and military service. Here's another thing that we don't think about, but I will tell you as someone that has to teach 18 to 21-year-olds, we should. And that's character guidance. In allowing the military to conscript their sons, American parents expected the Army to make them better people. It didn't mean necessarily teaching them to bayonet communists. It did mean taking teenagers and teaching them civics and patriotism and obedience and values and discipline and so forth. The Army was seen as a place for social experimentation. Okay? And people looked to it to take this unredeemable group of skulking, greasy, horrible people called teenagers and turn them into decent, hardworking American citizens. And by and large, the Army did it. I've talked to a lot of veterans, many of whom hated their Army service. Okay, anyone from my high school, or from my department chairman, to Jules Pfeiffer, who some of you might remember is the famous. Jules Pfeiffer was in the Army, and he looks back on it and says, it was probably a good experience for me. It made me a satirist. And it fell to officers like Paul Herbert to indoctrinate young Americans in these virtues. The other thing that being a citizen soldier Army meant was turning these people in their off-duty hours into decent people. I mean, if you know what the pre-war regular Army's image was, you know it was not good. And if you don't know what it was, you should watch a movie called From Here to Eternity, which was written by a guy who served in that. And by the way, the movie is a lot cleaner than the book is. The book, and what these guys did is drink and hang out with loose women and fight with each other. And that was really what the Army's reputation was. The 50s soldier was not that type of Army. Okay? The 50s soldier was a citizen soldier, and the Army was expected to give him healthful activities. He was given the opportunity to play guitar. Most posts had their own musical instruments. If they wanted to form a band, they could form a band, and they did. Okay? If he wanted, what if a good American soldier needs? An ice cream parlor, right? That's what the 50s do. Well, that's a 50s ice cream parlor, except it's in Vienna. Okay. What's that? Well, that's an American supermarket, right? Another symbol of the 1950s, except that's in Germany. Okay. And of course, there's boxing. And we all know that. Early rock and roll. But here's an Army-paid choir master teaching a soul group. The 1950s, the Army boasted it administered the biggest library system, the biggest chain of movie theaters, and the biggest amateur sports program in the world. And most people really enjoyed that part of it. But as with entertainment and teaching and so forth, it did take time away from preparing for atomic war. I don't know if you can read that, but this is Willie and Joe. Okay. Said, hello, Fox 4. I just called for a couple little old rounds of artillery. I didn't ask for no catastrophes. And there is Elvis Presley behind a bazooka. Some people say, well, that's the great problem in the 1950s Army. You had this atomic age equipment, and you had draftees running it. But in fact, these are still important questions for the United States Army and for all the armed forces. And I would say that quotation's probably been said yesterday as well. I've noticed that there's been an increasing fixation with technology and concepts, and this has really emerged since the last 20, 30 years. In the last 2 decades, we've heard technology-based concepts of war. We've heard full-spectrum dominance. We've heard effects-based operations. We've talked network-centric warfare, multi-domain battle, shock and awe. The buzzwords change, but the concepts, I would say, are very similar. Somehow the United States is going to wage wars that are rapid, decisive, and virtually bloodless. Well, the reality is we're getting to know much different. And the fact is that none of these marvels of technology, then or now, are going to work if you don't have skilled laborers to maintain and operate them and skilled managers or officers to direct them. I think we're doing a great disservice to ourselves as citizens when we ignore that inconvenient truth that the accuracy of our weapons is probably now even greater than the accuracy of the people who are firing them. The generation that Elvis was in had no illusions about a rapid, decisive, bloodless war. During most of the time he was in uniform, Elvis was a scout in the 3rd Armored Division. His sergeant was a World War II veteran. I'm pretty sure his company commander was a World War II veteran. His battalion commander, all the way up. These guys had done time in World War II or Korea, or in many cases, both. And they knew a little bit about war. 9 months of combat, the 3rd Armored Division had taken 2,000 battle deaths. By my estimation, that's more than the entire U.S. Armed Forces have taken in 15 years of fighting in Afghanistan. The 1st Infantry Division, by the way, suffered over 20,000 casualties. Had war been declared when Elvis was in uniform, the estimates in Europe were 3 to 5 million deaths in the first week of fighting. Presley, who was in a scout unit, would undoubtedly have been killed in the first 24 hours because he was right on the German border, and if they were going to drop a nuke, that was where they were going to do it. And I think it says a great deal about the United States Army and those who served in it, these citizen soldiers, that they simply soldiered on, they did their duty, they went back, most of the time to civilian life, never called themselves heroes. Elvis was really clear about that. All of them I've talked to look back on their service with a lot of nostalgia, a lot of honesty. I got great stories about how messed up everything was, but also all the things that went well. I haven't yet run into a veteran that regretted being in the United States Army. They all think it made them better citizens and better people. So they might be forgotten by the United States Army, and they might be forgotten by their fellow Americans, but they haven't forgotten their Army, and I'm really proud of them for doing it. Thank you very much.
So we'll be taking questions. We have the microphones, so please raise your hand and someone will come around and make sure we get it on the video here.
That is from Glasgow, by the way. So Elvis is a truly universal phenomenon.
So do we have any questions?
Hi. Great presentation. And just curious, so when the guys out in the field have the tactical nuclear weapon, the Davy Crockett, how much does that weigh? I mean, who has to lug that around and get that in position? And
That's a great story. I mean, as you saw, it was shown there's only a 5-man group. Though if you look at that picture closely, you'll notice that everyone's got at least 6 stripes. So that was a very high concentration of non-commissioned officers. These were all regular Army people of maybe 10 to 12 years to be on that. So, well, look, we have 5 people. Look at this. We've actually decentralized and shrunk this down. But the Davy Crockett didn't have its own security detail, which, required a lot of soldiers, and it didn't have its own warehouses. So if you've got atomic weapons, you have to go through these security codes, and you have to go to special warfare school to learn about that. So it actually sucked up about 200 people, which the infantry and the people assigned to it really didn't like. The other story, and I hadn't figured this out, but the sergeant explained this to me. He said, the interesting thing about the Davy Crockett, he used a Davy Crockett on a Davy Crockett unit, he said, it's a really simple mechanism. He said it's essentially a pipe like a mortar, and it's got this warhead on a spigot, and it shoots it out. It doesn't get much simpler than that. He said, and you know what? It was always broken. Could never figure it out, I said, well, okay, you figure the blast radius is 2 kilometers, and the range is, about that. I don't know why it was broken either. But anyone that's worked on a construction crew knows when something's life-threatening, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. We can't explain it. It just keeps breaking down. Well, one of the parts of that was you had to have really smart officers, obviously, if you're going to trust, a second lieutenant or a lieutenant with one of these. They have to be your best and brightest. You know what happens when you fail 2 inspections. You get relieved. So one of the reasons they finally got rid of the Davy Crockett was it was a career killer to your best officers. Okay. You had to sort of get it out of there because your best people kept flunking inspections, and then they'd get relieved. And then when you had Bruce Clark, not only the captain get relieved, his major and maybe his lieutenant colonel. So you were simply, you would find, someone said, I don't know if it was lethal to the Soviets, but it was sure lethal to the U.S. Army's personnel system.
I was wondering how the Pentomic Army and the thinking and the tactics changed as Eisenhower and Taylor moved into the Vietnam era.
Well, by that time Eisenhower had retired. Taylor's out. He writes a very critical book about this. But even within about a year after he had left as Chief of Staff of the Army, the Pentomic was on its way out. It just wasn't working on so many levels. And there's some fascinating accounts, including the commanding general of the 101st, who writes, when are we going to say this? It doesn't work. Okay, this is like, I've been doing these exercises for 6 years, and they don't work. It's not going to work. He says something like, I'd rather take the chance of being atomicized than lose because my troops can't fight, in any conditions. So it was on its way out. Now, Taylor fought hard to retain it, but it was replaced by something called the ROAD division shortly afterwards, and that's what we went to Vietnam with. But as with all great ideas, it took a long time to sort of, to get rid of it. There was someone here was in the 4th Infantry Division that went through Pentomic, and it's just fascinating to watch all the cascading problems as you go through this organization. It's just, and they're really well-intentioned people trying to make it work, which is really, there weren't a lot of slackers. They were really trying to make it work, and it just doesn't work. Oh, okay, Paul.
So, Brian, I got 1,000 questions, but one of the questions I have is about the statistics about all the Cat 4s.
Mm-hmm.
And to what degree did that reflect draft policy and policy for deferments? I registered for the draft in the 60s, and I can remember all the rules and all that sort of stuff about who went and who didn't go. Mm-hmm. And so could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point, and it's something that Hershey keeps bringing up when he's talking about selective service, as he keeps trying to tell these guys in the Army, you think the draft is a way to funnel people into the U.S. Army. It's not. It's a form of national service in which the nation prioritizes those skills it most needs, just like it did in World War II. Okay? And if the nation needs high school teachers, then it's going to set the system up so that it will generate high school teachers. If it needs lawyers or engineers, which is why the draft was deferred for students, you had a 2S deferment. for 4 years. And if you went into certain occupations, the odds of getting drafted started shrinking very quickly. It was a form of national service in a way, but not necessarily going into military service. And again, that's something we don't think about right now, but how productive the 1950s were was in part because students had a real incentive to get through in 4 years and to keep their grades up and to go on to high-skilled professions. You didn't have, oh, I want to spend 3 years to find myself. When you want to find yourself, put on a uniform. They'll tell you where you are. Okay. So that was, and that is why people have this perception of selective service as only trying to generate troops. Now, the other thing about this Category 4s and the sergeants is the Army in 1957 went through a purge, if you will. But it was a benevolent purge because they offered education to all those sergeants. Okay, they tested them, and then they said, okay, we will give you so many hours every week to go to school and bring yourself up to an 8th grade education. And they had about a third of them didn't do it, but the other 2/3 did. And there's some really very heartwarming testimonials, where this sergeant tells the general, this education business is great. I wish I'd been offered it earlier. And he had gone up until he's got his high school equivalency, and he was now getting a master sergeant. He was going to become, I think, an E8, and he now qualified. And this was the most exciting thing. The Army had given him a chance. So it's not just saying these people, you're useless, you're rejects. It was really making an effort to reform them. And I think that's a great thing. And it really irritates me when people say it's not a social experiment. Because, in fact, in the 50s, they did think it was a social experiment. It was a way of making, in many ways, people better, giving them an education, giving them a skill. Now it's all, like break things and kill people, which I just find is a very strange view of our armed forces. That's, yes, sir.
Here we go.
Now, in the late 60s, when I was in basic training, we had one platoon of those soldiers who were juvenile delinquents and told by a judge, okay, you can go to prison or into the Army for 3 years. Now, to what extent were there those people in the 50s Army?
Yeah. That's actually been around. I'm reading stuff from the early 1900s, by the way, and there's the same complaint. The judges are telling people, you are either going to go to prison or reform school or you're going to enlist. And now, so you remember if you were juvenile and you hadn't been convicted and you enlisted, you didn't have a criminal record when you came in. So you essentially wiped the slate clean. 11th Airborne was known as a really thug outfit, and a friend of mine that was in the 11th Airborne, Joe, said, in my unit of about 30, he was a second lieutenant, he said about 12 of the regular Army guys, and I think he had about 15, had all exercised that option of enlisting. He said, these are just the guys I wanted to go into combat with the Soviets with. So, yeah, there was that element. On the other hand, our prisons are filled with people right now, okay? And how many of those people at the age of 18 were given a chance to go do something else? And I'll tell you, one of the things the Army did do is very few of those people in the first, the volunteers had a bad habit of going AWOL because a lot of these guys are immature and they join at 18, they get homesick and they take off. But one of the things, when you look at who's going into Leavenworth during this period, it's not the draftees and it's not the first-year volunteers if they're not going in for AWOL. It's career criminals. Okay? So in many ways, the Army did reform these people. If the statistics are any indication. I don't think it necessarily turned them into, good all-American boys like Elvis, but it sort of taught them the basics of discipline and probably gave them some self-respect and some education, and they came out better.
Some did.
Exactly. And that's what we have to accept. We're not millennials. Everyone's not perfect. We all, It's not, 90% of us are above average. This is a hard thing teaching now. You say, about a third of you aren't going to get through college in 4 years, and some of you aren't going to do it. And that was the Army's choice. You shape up. Well, if you're going to ship out, it's going to ship out to Leavenworth or some hard time in the stockade. And most people, given that opportunity, did better. We don't do that now, at all, and I think it's a shame, actually. Yes, sir. I think they want you to have the mic so because they record it.
This is probably a really dumb thing to question, but as I'm listening to it, it's like, why don't our schools study from the Army so our students can come out better?
Well, because now, for people, you're not allowed to do a lot of the stuff that they get to do. I mean, I can't, I would like to, but I'm not allowed to. The second thing is, the schools are not prisons, and the Army's not a prison. There was a perception in the 1950s that the schools were failing, and the church was failing, and the politics were failing. All the institutions that in 50s minds had held society together were failing. And they looked to the armed forces in the 13-year brief period to do a lot of that social reformation. Okay? And maybe it was good, maybe it was bad. Most of my students would not think highly of doing 2 years of involuntary servitude. But it was a great experiment. I think we can learn a lot from it, as long as we look at it honestly. The people that upset me are the people that don't look at it honestly. They have this romantic idea that we're going to take, wayward youth and have them out, like the CCC, building forests and setting up, soup kitchens and going in the armed forces. That's just not what Selective Service was ever. It's dangerous, I think, to have a romantic view of 18-year-olds that if you take them out of their homes and don't put them under military discipline, that they're going to behave well. And I come from A&M, which is a pretty well-behaved school, but I would not want to take those people out and march them through the country for 3 days without some very large sergeant around to sort of back me up. Okay.
Did the Army choose to educate them, or was that a mandated piece, or was it a bit of both?
Bit of both, very much. I mean, I think it was mandated that they do this by Congress, but what's impressive to me is how willingly so many soldiers did it. If you look at what the Army did for African American soldiers in this place called Kitzingen, Germany, they set up this, they didn't have to, from about 1950 and 1953, and they got these people in, and this was coming out of the Army's, ability to do its other jobs. But it was teaching basic literacy, basic sanitation, and that was not required. That was something the Army in Europe took on for itself. And so I think we should not look on it as these people are just following orders. We should look on it as these are products of the Depression and World War II who had a serious commitment to making the nation better. I think he's going to cut me off now.
So that was terrific talk, and I appreciate it, Brian, very much. And I think it underscores a point that I've tried to make a couple times up here. The Army belongs to us, right? It's our Army. It's our soldiers. It's part of our country. And it's up to us, the public, to define what our Army does for us, where it's sent, how its soldiers are treated. And it's up to us to receive its veterans back into our society and take care of them. And I think this is just a great example of how those dynamics were at work for better and for ill in the 1950s, and that responsibility has not gone away from American society. So I got a couple announcements, but before I do that, I have a prize for Brian, who discovered that if you turn the page over to what you need, it's written it on the other side. Speaking about making,
high tech,
yeah. Academia will undoubtedly be better when you retire too, my friend. But anyway, but this is our regimental coin. It's got the crest on the front, the big red one, and the oak leaf, which is a symbol of the 1st Division Museum at Cantini. And we change the backside every year depending on what's going on that year. And this year it's pretty cool because it's the centennial of the 1st Division, 1917 to 2017. And the seal on the back of this is the seal that the veterans adopted as their seal when they came back from World War I in 1919. So you get a centennial 1st Division coin, my friend. Thank you so much. Okay, so our Legionnaires are in the back, and I forgot to bring the red, white, and blue mailbox for the first time, I think, in like 10 years, right? So they have a picture, hold up the picture, but I promise you that the loose change that gets in there is going to go to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, Illinois, an institution that you ought to know about and you ought to support, because tonight we think that 1,100 approximately honorably discharged veterans of the American Armed Forces will go to sleep outside a shelter in the state of Illinois. And the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Vets is here in DuPage County, and Wheaton is trying to do something about that. So, yeah, there you go. There you go. Okay. So, and if you want to support the Legion and you want to support the shelter, you can show up on August 7th, which I think is this Monday, right? This coming Monday. Here at 4:30 p.m., we're having a pasta dinner. What more could you want? It's going to be fabulous, so please come to that, and we'll ask you to donate. I will have the red, white, and blue mailbox, and I'll ask you to donate again to the Midwest Shelter. The 1st Division Museum reopens on August 26th. If you want to come and celebrate with a bunch of retired generals and some 1st Division soldiers and hear the cannons boom and do all that, please come. If you actually want to see the museum, come sometime after August 26th, because I think we're going to have a ton of people there. We're having another date with history. We try to do it the first Wednesday of every month, so our next one will be in September. Newly minted Dr. Hai Nguyen, a citizen of Vietnam, will be here to talk about his interviews that he did partly under our sponsorship in Vietnam, tracking down veterans of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army who fought against the 1st Infantry Division, and he'll talk about his research on the Viet Cong and the NVA, and I think it'll be really, really interesting. And let me see, what else did I come up here to say? I think that's it. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Brian. And we hope to see you at Cantini on August 26th or thereafter and at the next event. Thanks very much. And Brian's book is...